Some love stories begin with candlelight and promises. This one began with a mistake, a tired assistant, the wrong room, and a night that neither of them would ever forget. Sienna Morgan had long understood that working for Callum Hayes wasn't a job, it was survival in a suit and heels. He wasn't cruel, but he was distant, impossibly brilliant, meticulous to a fault, and he wielded silence like a scalpel, precise, cold, and just sharp enough to make you bleed. As his personal assistant, Sienna had become fluent in his moods, his calendar, his impossible expectations. She never flinched, never faltered, but she also knew one wrong move, and she could be replaced in a heartbeat. Tonight, though, the stakes were different. Callum had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal at an exclusive tech summit held in a luxury coastal resort in Monterey Bay. The hard part was over. For once, they weren't racing deadlines or fixing PR fires. For once, there was space to exhale. They were dining with investors at a beachfront restaurant that shimmered in candlelight and sea breeze. Callum, always so composed, had even lifted a glass of wine with something close to joy. "Even you are allowed to relax tonight, Sienna," he said quietly, as if the words were unfamiliar on his tongue. She looked at him, really looked, and for a fleeting moment saw the man behind the empire. The tension in his shoulders had loosened. His laughter came easier. He wasn't smiling for strategy tonight. He was simply being. She raised her glass. "Didn't know the great Callum Hayes was capable of fun." "And I didn't know you were capable of sitting still," he returned, eyes glinting with dry humor. One glass became 2, became 5. The lines blurred between assistant and boss, tension and ease, the professional and the personal. By the end of the evening, their laughter had softened into something gentler, warmer. "You're drunk," he told her, pointing his fork with theatrical flair. "You're drunk," she countered, poking her butter knife in return. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, smiled. "I'm calling it a night," he said, standing with just enough of a sway to betray the wine. And just like that, he was gone. Sienna lingered longer, the stars above spinning just slightly too fast. The world softened by laughter and wine and the novelty of a night without expectations. When she finally stood, her legs wobbled beneath her, as if gravity itself was unsure. "One task," she mumbled, trying to stay upright. "Find room, remove shoes, collapse." It would have been easy if she remembered what room she was in. The hallway lights were dim, the carpet a blur beneath her feet. The numbers on the doors shimmered, refusing to stay still. Who chose this font? It's dancing," she muttered. Then, salvation. A door just slightly ajar. She smiled in relief, pushed it open, kicked off her shoes and let herself fall onto the bed like a stone into water. Best hotel ever. She sighed and was asleep before the second breath. What she didn't realize? It wasn't her room. At sunrise, Callum stirred. His head was foggy, but not unpleasantly so. The air smelled faintly of ocean salt and linen. And then something shifted beside him. He blinked. Strange dream, his mind offered. Then, my pillow is breathing. And finally, my pillow has hair. His eyes flew open. Lying beside him, curled up peacefully beneath the covers, was Sienna, sound asleep. Oblivious. A soft breath escaping her lips as she mumbled something incoherent. He stared at the ceiling, one hand raking through his hair as if seeking divine explanation. He remembered the wine, the laughter. But this was not in the itinerary, yet there she was, Sienna Morgan, in his bed, like she belonged there. Sienna had no idea what kind of storm she'd just wandered into. Across the room, Callum Hayes dragged a hand down his face, trying to gather the scattered pieces of last night wine, laughter, her smile, too many glasses, and now this. But before he could fully register the situation, she stirred. Still wrapped in the warmth of the covers, Sienna stretched with the kind of bliss reserved for deep sleep and soft beds. "Best bed in the world," she murmured, smiling into the pillow. And then she hugged it, except it wasn't a pillow. Her brows knit together. Something was wrong. Slowly she blinked her eyes open, adjusting to the morning light, and found herself nose to chest with someone. A very real, very toned, very familiar chest. Her heart tripped, and then she looked up, straight into Callum's wide, stunned eyes. 3 seconds passed in perfect stillness. Then chaos. Sienna bolted upright, got tangled in the sheets, and landed on the floor in a breathless heap. "What are you doing in my room?" she shouted, voice rising in panic. Callum sat up with a groan, rubbing the back of his neck like someone in a very slow-moving nightmare. "This is my room," he said tiredly. Sienna blinked. The curtains weren't right. The colour of the carpet was wrong. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air, and then on the armchair his suit, perfectly folded. And suddenly it hit her like a freight train. Oh no. Oh yes. She covered her face, embarrassment flooding every inch of her skin. I walked into the wrong room. Callum crossed his arms, watching her like she was a piece of software that had just crashed. Seems that way. "I didn't mean to," she blurted out, her voice tight with rising panic. I got turned around. The doors all looked the same, and the font was Sienna, he interrupted gently. "If I thought you did it on purpose, security would have been here already." That stopped her cold. Oh, right. That makes sense. Callum studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "Just answer me one thing," he said quietly. "Do you remember anything from last night?" A chill ran down her spine. "That depends," she said slowly. "What do you mean by anything?" He didn't answer at first, as if still trying to decide if this was real or some dream he hadn't quite woken from. "You woke up smiling." Sienna froze. "I what?" "Like someone who just had the best sleep of their life," he added, a touch of disbelief in his voice. She felt her face go hot. "That doesn't mean anything. I certainly hope not." Silence settled between them again, thick, awkward. She scrambled to find her shoes, hair a wild mess, heart pounding like a drum. "Okay," she muttered, more to herself than him. "This didn't happen. No one ever has to know. I'm leaving. Right now." Callum nodded. "Great idea." And then a knock. They both froze. "Sienna," he whispered. She was pale. "That's the universe punishing me." "Hide," he said, standing up fast. "Where?" "The couch." Too obvious. "The closet?" "What if I get stuck?" Callum pointed to the bed, then under. She didn't argue. In one panicked motion, she dove beneath the frame just as he reached for the door. Standing outside was Natalie, one of their colleagues, her morning energy far too bright for the situation. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she chirped. "Sorry to barge in so early, but..." She stopped, squinted at him. "You look different." Callum narrowed his eyes. "Different? How?" "I don't know. Just like you didn't sleep well. It's the lighting in the room." "Right," she said slowly. "Well, breakfast is ready downstairs. And oh, one more thing. Have you seen Sienna? She vanished after dinner and hasn't been answering her phone." Under the bed, Sienna stopped, breathing. "No," Callum said smoothly. "Haven't seen her." Natalie frowned, unconvinced. Strange. Anyway, see you down there." As soon as the door clicked shut, Callum let out a long breath. From beneath the bed, Sienna whispered, "Please, tell me that's the only person who's coming." "Let's hope so," Callum replied, pinching the bridge of his nose. Above them both, the day was already beginning, but neither had the faintest clue how much it was about to change everything. As soon as the door clicked shut, Sienna crawled out from beneath the bed, hair disheveled, cheeks flushed, and dignity nowhere in sight. That, she muttered, slipping on her heels with what little grace she had left, was a waking nightmare. Callum, now leaning against the dresser with his arms crossed, didn't disagree. I completely agree. Okay, she exhaled. It's settled. I'm going back to my room, pretending this never happened, and moving on with my life like a mature, responsible adult. Probably for the best, Callum said, watching her with that unreadable calm that made her feel 10 times more flustered. Great, she nodded, spinning on her heel. So, I'm going. Now. Immediately. But before she could reach the door, his voice stopped her. Sienna. She froze. Yes? A pause. Then, in the most infuriatingly casual tone imaginable, he added, If you ever plan on accidentally breaking into my room again, maybe knock first. She turned around, eyes wide. Are you joking about this? He tilted his head slightly, just enough to blur the line between serious and smug. Maybe. Sienna stared at him, utterly scandalized. I am never drinking around you again. And with that, she marched out of the room mortified, humiliated, and entirely unable to shake the heat from her face. But no matter how determined she was to erase the night from memory, a small, inconvenient truth sat in her chest like a secret. This would never be forgotten. Now, if you're still reading, type Sunrise Smoothie in the comments. Let's see who's really paying attention. We'll keep this moment between us. Sienna walked through the resort corridors like she was fleeing a crime scene. Every polished tile felt like a spotlight, every passing glance like a verdict. Her heart thudded as she clutched her room key like a lifeline. Okay, 2 goals, she told herself. 1, get to my room. 2, pretend last night never happened. Simple, logical, foolproof. Until she turned the corner and collided with Natalie. Sienna! Natalie's voice shot up like a fire alarm. Sienna flinched. Natalie, hey. Hi. Morning. You disappeared last night. Where were you? Sienna's brain scrambled to load a convincing lie, but her mouth, traitorous as always, beat it to the finish line. I slept. Natalie raised an eyebrow. Really? Because your hair is a mess, your clothes are wrinkled, and you look like you've just seen a ghost. Sienna forced a laugh. Yeah, rough night. Pillows were too soft. Or too hard. Or maybe they attacked me. Natalie folded her arms. You were with Callum Hayes, weren't you? Sienna's soul momentarily left her body. What? Why would you think that? Because I went to his room earlier and he looked off, like someone with something to hide. Sienna could feel sweat collecting at her collarbone. Maybe he just had a bad night too. It happens. People sleep weird. Natalie narrowed her eyes further. You're not hiding anything, are you? Of course not. You seem nervous. I am not nervous. Sienna snapped. Natalie blinked. I'm hungry, Sienna added quickly. Low blood sugar makes me yell. Ah, Natalie said, stepping back. That tracks. Sienna exhaled like she'd just disarmed a bomb. Come on, Natalie said, hooking her arm. Let's get food, and you can tell me everything about this bad sleep. Sienna smiled tightly. Can't wait. They entered the breakfast hall, a beautiful space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and flaky pastries. Normally, it would have felt like paradise. But all Sienna could see was Callum, seated several tables ahead, deep in conversation with 2 investors. He looked as perfect as ever, clean-cut, focused, unbothered. Not a single trace of the fact that just hours ago she'd woken up in his bed. You're staring at him weird, Natalie whispered. Sienna nearly choked on her breath. Sienna nearly choked on her coffee. I am not staring, she said, setting the cup down a little too quickly. Natalie arched a brow. Then why is your hand shaking? Sienna clenched her jaw. I'm just tense about the merger meetings today. Natalie nodded slowly, accepting the excuse for now. But Sienna knew the truth was a whisper away from spilling. One wrong look, one poorly timed question, and the entire facade might unravel. After breakfast, the team moved into the resort's conference hall, a sweeping glass-walled space overlooking the ocean where final negotiations were scheduled to take place. The company merger had been months in the making, and everything came down to the next few hours. Sienna should have been focused, but she wasn't, because every time she glanced up from her documents, her gaze collided with his. Callum sat across the room, composed and silent, but his eyes kept flicking to her. And every time they met hers, he tilted his head just slightly, like he was silently asking, "Still thinking about it, aren't you?" She wanted to throw her notepad at him, or at least disappear behind it. Instead, she tightened her grip on her pen, stared down at the charts, and tried to will herself invisible. But he was enjoying this far too much. Midway through a tense discussion on shareholder percentages, his voice cut clean through the room. "Sienna, would you mind reviewing these reports?" His tone was cool, professional, but his eyes held that glint again, that maddening flicker of amusement. "Of course, Mr. Hayes," she replied calmly, refusing to let her voice crack. He gave her the faintest smile, and in that moment Sienna realized something horrifying. Callum had no intention of letting this go. When the meeting finally adjourned, she was on her feet in seconds, aiming for the exit. But before she could vanish into the crowd, his voice followed her. "Miss Morgan, a moment, please." She froze. Natalie gave her a curious look. "Tell me everything later." With a resigned breath, Sienna turned and followed Callum down a quiet hallway to a small private lounge. He closed the door behind them, turning to face her with the composed intensity that made people nervous even on their best day. "We need to talk," he said. She crossed her arms. "If this is about this morning, I'm already pretending it didn't happen." "I noticed," he said smoothly. "Unfortunately, I haven't managed to forget." Her stomach tightened. What exactly does that mean? Callum took a step closer, not threatening, just deliberate. "Do you really think pretending it didn't happen makes it disappear?" "Yes," she said, too quickly. He exhaled a quiet laugh. "That's unfortunate. Because you breaking into my room, that's not the kind of story people forget. And if word gets out, no one can find out," she snapped. "Exactly," he said, folding his arms. "So I suggest you make sure nothing looks suspicious." Her eyes narrowed. "That sounds like a threat." He tilted his head. "It's a reminder." Sienna's breath hitched. "Do you want something from me?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze searched hers, measured and unreadable. "Just your cooperation," he said at last. She didn't know what that meant. Not really. But the way he said it, calm, assured, like he already knew she wouldn't say no, sent a quiet shiver through her. She left the room with her heart pounding, her thoughts tangled. What did he mean by cooperation? And why did he seem so calm, while she felt like she was standing in a collapsing building? Sienna walked through the hallways of the resort like someone trying to outrun her own thoughts. She had lunch with Natalie in less than 10 minutes. She needed to act normal, be normal, convince herself that everything was fine, even if nothing was. By the time she reached the sunlit restaurant terrace, Natalie was already at a corner table, waving her over. "You took forever," she teased, spooning salad onto her plate. "What did Callum want?" Sienna paused, swallowing back everything. Nothing major, just some project updates. Natalie's eyes narrowed. "Right. And that's why you look like you saw a ghost." "I'm just tired," Sienna replied with a shaky laugh. It's been a long few days, but the moment she started eating, she felt it his gaze. She looked up instinctively. Callum sat a few tables away, in conversation with a pair of clients. His posture was relaxed, expression unreadable. But then, just for a second, his eyes met hers. A glance. Sharp, measured, waiting, and just like that she knew. He was watching her, testing her. Sienna looked back down, trying to focus on her food, trying to be unaffected. But she could feel it. He wasn't finished with her. Not yet. Back in her room, Sienna tried to lose herself in work. She opened her laptop, pulled up reports, and attempted to refocus her mind on quarterly projections and contract clauses, but the words swam. And then the phone rang. She stared at it for a beat, reluctant to answer. Finally, she picked up. "Hello?" Callum's voice came through, low and direct. "Come to the terrace. Now." No greeting, no explanation, just an order. And before she could respond, the line went dead. Sienna stared at the receiver, her stomach knotting. Something was wrong. She threw on her blazer and made her way to the terrace, the ocean breeze brushing against her skin like a quiet warning. Callum stood at the far end, leaning on the railing, his back to her. He didn't turn when she approached, just kept staring out at the horizon as if the sea held answers. "Are you hiding something from me?" he asked, his voice calm but not casual. Sienna crossed her arms. "What's that supposed to mean?" Callum turned, eyes studying her with surgical precision. "You've been avoiding me. Since this morning, you've barely looked in my direction. It's like you think you've committed a crime." "I'm avoiding a scandal," she replied coolly. "There's a difference, is that so?" His tone was unreadable, but his gaze was sharp. "Because now the investors are starting to ask questions." Sienna blinked. "What kind of questions?" He stepped a little closer. "Someone saw you leaving my suite." The words hit like ice down her spine. "Who? Does it matter?" he asked. "The point is, there's a rumor going around." Sienna's heart began to pound. "About us?" Callum nodded. "They think we spent the night together." Her breath caught. "That's not just a rumor. That's working," he said simply. She stared at him. "What?" "The Callahans are key investors. They value partnership, long-term thinking, trust, stability. Now that they believe we're involved, they've become even more interested in finalizing the deal." Sienna was still trying to process. "That's absurd." "Maybe," he admitted, "but it's also effective." She stared at him, stunned. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "I want you to pretend to be my girlfriend." Sienna choked. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me. This is insane." "Possibly," he said, unbothered. "But you care about this deal. I care about this deal. And right now, appearances matter." She opened her mouth to protest, but there was no good argument. The merger was crucial for Hayes Tech, for her team, for the future of everything they'd been building. And Callum knew exactly how seriously she took her job. Her voice faltered. "It doesn't have to be over the top," he added quickly. "A few dinners, some smiles. Let them see us as a united front. When the trip ends, we go back to our separate lives." She shook her head slowly, trying to hold on to logic. "You want me to fake date you in front of everyone?" "Yes. And in exchange," she said, voice quieter now, "you'll make sure no one ever hears about what happened this morning." Callum's eyes softened. Exactly. The silence between them felt heavy. Somewhere deep down, a small, irrational voice whispered, "And what if you're curious what it's like to pretend? What if it doesn't feel like pretending at all?" Sienna swallowed. Her choice wasn't really a choice. "Fine," she said finally, her tone firm. "But when we get back to the city, this ends." Callum's smile was small, almost pleased. Perfect. As she walked back through the resort, Sienna felt the full weight of what she'd just agreed to settle on her chest. She had just agreed to become her boss's fake girlfriend. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie, and yet it was very much her real life. When she reached her room, she collapsed face first onto the bed, groaning into the mattress. "How did I end up here?" she muttered. One less glass of wine, one better hallway decision, one locked hotel door. That's all it would have taken to avoid this whole surreal spiral. Instead, she was now the leading lady in a performance she hadn't auditioned for. A knock on the door pulled her out of her spiral. The knock startled her. "Sienna." "Open the door." Callum's voice, low, composed, and just a little impatient, slid through the wooden frame like a command. She let out a breath, pulled herself upright, and opened the door. He was already leaning against the doorway, perfectly put together, as if last night had been a footnote in someone else's story. "I trust you've had time to absorb the plan," he said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. Sienna closed the door behind him, folding her arms. "You say it like it's simple." Callum gave her a look. "Isn't it?" She scoffed. "We're boss and assistant. Our conversations revolve around quarterly reports and your caffeine preferences. We have zero chemistry. How exactly do you expect us to be believable?" He raised an eyebrow, unfazed, "By establishing some rules." She blinked. "Rules. Rule 1, he began, ticking it off like a checklist. "You need to look comfortable around me. That means no glaring, no crossing your arms like you're under interrogation. Smiles, easy posture, easy for you to say." She muttered. He ignored the jab. "Rule 2, gestures matter. Light touches. Nothing theatrical, just familiarity. A hand on the shoulder, eye contact, something real." She stared at him like he'd asked her to recite poetry in Latin. "I can barely say good morning without sounding like an email." "That's why we're talking now," he said, voice patient but firm. "Rehearsal makes results. You want me to rehearse a fake relationship with you. I want you to be convincing," he said calmly. "Better to stumble here than fall apart in front of the investors." Sienna rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Deep down, she knew he was right. "Fine, but if this blows up..." "It won't," he said with a small, confident smirk. By sunset, the resort sky had softened into watercolor hues, and Sienna was dressed for the cocktail event in a sleek blue dress, elegant but understated. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to survive. When she stepped into the hallway, Callum was waiting. He looked like himself. A tailored dark suit, a clean shave, and the calm of someone who never questioned whether the world would bend to him. "Ready?" he asked. Sienna nodded, trying to summon courage. What could possibly go wrong? Callum smiled, and somehow that made her even more nervous. The cocktail lounge was already buzzing by the time they entered. The Callahan investors stood near the far side of the room, glasses in hand, conversations flowing easily. But as Sienna and Callum walked in side by side, heads turned, eyes followed. Whispers started. From across the room, one of the investors, Charles Callahan, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, approached with a knowing smile. "Callum Hayes," he said warmly. "Pleasure to see you both." "So, is it true what they're saying?" Sienna stiffened. Her heart skipped a beat, but before she could find her voice, Callum's arm slid lightly around her waist. A soft, casual gesture, too easy, too practiced. "Yes," he said smoothly. "It's true." Sienna managed a smile. Small, controlled. "It's been unexpected, but good." Charles chuckled. "Well, I must say it gives us even more confidence in this partnership. Stability, trust. It all shows." Sienna had no idea how to respond to that, so she smiled again, hoping that was enough. Callum, of course, was perfectly at ease. "Shall we get something to drink?" he murmured, steering her gently toward the bar. Once they were far enough from the group, Sienna leaned toward him. "How do you make this look so effortless?" He gave a barely there shrug. "The trick is not to overthink it." She scoffed. "Easy for you. You're not the one pretending to like someone who treats you like an Excel spreadsheet." Callum glanced at her sideways. "I never said I didn't like you." Sienna blinked, thrown off by the shift in his tone. Before she could form a response, another group of investors approached. The moment dissolved like mist in sunlight, replaced by small talk, laughter, and the polite choreography of corporate charm. By the end of the evening, Sienna was still standing, still smiling, and somehow still pretending, though she had to admit she was doing better than she thought she would. And worse, part of her didn't know if all of this was still just an act. What surprised Sienna most wasn't how easy it had become to fake closeness with Callum. It was how natural it started to feel. At first, the touch of his hand on the small of her back, or the way he leaned in to whisper something low and polite, felt like part of the role, mechanical, calculated. But then, during a conversation with two key investors, Callum's hand slid over hers, discreet, deliberate, warm, and something in her stilled. Her eyes darted up to meet his, expecting to find a look that said, "Just playing the part." But what she found instead was something quieter, something unspoken, and far more dangerous. Was this still pretend? Or had he simply become too good at pretending? Sienna's stomach turned with a kind of tension she didn't know how to name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't exactly excitement. It was awareness, and it was growing. The cocktail party lingered on well past sunset, filled with clinking glasses, soft jazz, and the low hum of negotiations that had nothing to do with contracts. Sienna found herself smiling more easily, laughing more naturally, and every time Callum touched her elbow or met her gaze across the room, it didn't feel forced anymore. That scared her more than anything. As they strolled through the resort's moonlit garden afterward, the cool air was a welcome relief from the heat that had built inside her all evening. "I think we managed to fool everyone," Sienna murmured, her heels tapping softly against the path. Callum glanced sideways at her, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "I wouldn't call it fooling. We simply supported a narrative that was already unfolding." "A narrative you're clearly enjoying," she said, folding her arms. He stopped, turning toward her. "You're benefiting too, Sienna. You like a challenge, and now you're in one," she scoffed, looking away. "Don't act like you know me. I know more than you think." His voice was low, closer, too close. Sienna turned and found him standing just inches from her. The air between them seemed charged, like a storm waiting to break. Her heart skipped. Why was he looking at her like that? Callum tilted his head slightly, lips curving into something almost teasing. "Are you afraid of having a little fun?" Her eyes widened. "This isn't about fun. What if it could be?" Sienna opened her mouth, ready to push back, but the words never came, because in that moment his eyes flicked to her lips, just for a breath. And when they rose to meet hers again, something shifted in her chest. She stopped breathing. "Good night, Sienna," he said, his voice lower, almost intimate. And then he turned and walked away, calm, composed, like he hadn't just undone her entire sense of control. She stood there in the dark, pulse racing, trying to understand what had just happened. Was this part of the plan? Or had he moved the goalposts without telling her? Back in her room, she collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. She was supposed to sleep. She was supposed to shake it off. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was the way Callum had looked at her like the act was over and something else had already begun. This fake arrangement was starting to feel dangerously real, and Sienna wasn't sure if she could get through it without consequences. The next morning arrived far too quickly. An important meeting marked the final stretch of the contract negotiations. Everything was on the line, and Sienna knew she had to be sharp. But how was she supposed to focus when Callum was clearly enjoying getting under her skin? He sat beside her at the boardroom table, closer than usual. Their shoulders brushed more than once. Every now and then his knee would nudge hers, casually, as if by accident. He spoke with his usual confidence and clarity. But those fleeting glances, the ones only she seemed to catch, told a different story. They weren't rehearsing anymore. They were playing a new game, and Sienna wasn't sure she knew the rules anymore. The meeting break brought a rare moment of calm and an unexpected visitor. Charles Callahan approached them with a smile that practically radiated approval. "I have to say," he began, coffee in hand, "it's impressive how you two managed to balance a professional dynamic with a personal one." Sienna forced a polite smile. "It's a challenge, but we manage." Beside her, Callum nodded, his face composed and steady. "Sienna is an exceptional professional," he said, his voice calm but with just the faintest undercurrent of warmth. "Working with her while also sharing something personal has been enlightening." Sienna felt her cheeks flush. This wasn't just convincing, this was too convincing. He was weaving this narrative with such finesse, and worse, he was enjoying it. Charles beamed. When two people have genuine chemistry, everything flows naturally. Before Sienna could respond, Callum's hand slid gently to the small of her back. A light touch. A practiced one, only she felt it. Only she noticed the pause in her breath that followed. He was playing with fire. "Well, I'll leave the lovebirds to it," Charles added with a chuckle. "See you both shortly." As soon as he was out of earshot, Sienna turned to Callum. "What was that?" He raised an eyebrow, perfectly deadpan. "What do you mean? You're overplaying it." "I don't see it that way," he replied, a glimmer of mischief in his eyes. Sienna folded her arms. "This is still a business arrangement, Callum. I'm not a pawn in some game you're running." He leaned in slightly, his voice low, his breath brushing her ear. Then, "Stop acting like you're affected." A shiver raced down her spine. He knew the effect he had on her. Before she could respond, he stepped away, returning to the meeting as if he hadn't just unraveled her composure in a single sentence. Sienna exhaled slowly, steadying herself. If Callum Hayes wanted a game, she could play. And he had no idea who he was up against. The rest of the meeting proceeded with its usual rhythm, but Sienna's attention had sharpened. She studied Callum's every move, every glance, every pause, every twitch of his jaw. He wasn't the only one who could be subtle. Later, at the informal lunch on the terrace, Charles Callahan insisted they sit at his table along with several key investors. The sun glinted off the ocean, laughter floated across the breeze, and every gesture still felt like a performance. Only now, Sienna was leading the scene. "You two really do make quite the pair," Charles commented as he helped himself to a serving of roasted vegetables. "It's rare to see such balance professionally and personally." Sienna smiled, casting a quick glance at Callum. "It's all about mutual respect," she said smoothly, and knowing when to lead and when to follow. She saw the flicker in Callum's expression, a slight raise of his brow, curious, intrigued. Then, under the table, she leaned just enough for her leg to brush lightly against his. The contact was subtle, measured, intentional. He stilled, only for a second, but she noticed. He didn't move away. He didn't challenge it. He simply accepted it. The power shifted, and for the first time since this began, Callum Hayes looked like he didn't have the upper hand. The conversation flowed around them, but Sienna stayed attuned to him, the way his voice slowed, the way he adjusted his glass a little more carefully, like he was recalibrating. And then Charles turned to her again. "So, Sienna, what's it really like, being involved with one of the most admired figures in the industry?" She smiled, soft and warm, and rested her hand gently on Callum's arm, her touch feather light. "Oh, Callum can be intense at work," she said, letting her fingers glide over the crisp line of his sleeve, "but when he lets himself relax, He's surprisingly thoughtful. She felt him still beside her, felt the tension that hadn't been there before. He hadn't expected that move. She turned to him slowly, catching his gaze. And for once, he was the one holding his breath. For a fleeting moment, she saw something shift in Callum's eyes. It wasn't his usual composed amusement or that sharp glint of strategic thinking. It was something unguarded. Like for the first time, she had caught him off balance. But Callum Hayes wasn't the kind of man who stayed unbalanced for long. As the lunch concluded and guests began to gather their belongings, Callum moved with his usual ease. He stood and offered Sienna his hand, helping her up with gentlemanly charm. But before she could step away, his hand slid to the curve of her waist and lingered just a second too long. To the untrained eye, it was casual, natural, but Sienna knew better. It was a response, his counter move, a silent acknowledgement of the touch she'd initiated earlier. Her heart quickened, but she didn't let it show. If Callum thought he could test her limits, he needed to know something she played to win. Later that afternoon, needing space from the chessboard of gestures and words, Sienna made her way to the resort's pool. The sun was warm against her skin, the sound of water gently lapping nearby. And for once, she allowed herself to relax book in hand, the weight of pretending temporarily set aside. Until a shadow fell across the page. She looked up. Callum stood above her, still in a suit and sunglasses, arms crossed, smile faint but unmistakable. "Taking a break?" he asked. Sienna closed her book, unfazed. "Is that allowed? Or is your new strategy to keep me guessing at all times?" A rare chuckle escaped him. "You're catching on." She smiled. "And you don't like it when someone plays the game better than you." He said nothing, just loosened his tie and sat down on the lounger beside her. "I have to admit," he said, removing his sunglasses to meet her gaze directly, "you're not as predictable as I thought." Sienna lifted an eyebrow. "That bothers you?" "No," he said, watching her carefully. "What surprises me is how much you're enjoying this." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped, because he wasn't entirely wrong. For all the chaos, there was something undeniably electric between them now. Something that wasn't entirely performance. Something she couldn't ignore. Before she could respond, Natalie came rushing toward her from across the pool deck. "There you are. Dinner's been bumped up. We need to get ready." "Fast." Sienna exhaled, standing. "Looks like this conversation will have to wait." Callum slid his sunglasses back on, but not before she caught the smallest flicker of something softer in his expression. "I'll be waiting," he said. As she walked away, she could feel his gaze on her, and for the first time she realized something she hadn't dared admit until now. She wasn't pretending anymore. Back in her room, Sienna leaned against the door, trying to quiet the storm inside her chest. This was supposed to be simple, just a role, a temporary illusion. But the illusion had started to feel like the only real thing in the room. She walked to the closet and chose a sleek black dress, sophisticated, elegant, calculated, enough to look polished, enough to leave an impression, the kind of dress he would expect, the kind of woman she was learning to be around him. By the time she arrived at the dining hall, the air buzzed with soft conversation, the crystal chandeliers casting warm light across champagne glasses and polished cutlery. She recognized the investors instantly clustered in quiet discussions, their voices hushed and strategic. But the moment her eyes found his, everything else faded. Callum was standing by the bar, dressed in a black tailored suit, one hand resting casually in his pocket. He looked, as always, like he belonged to a world shaped by power and precision. But when he saw her, something shifted in his expression, something Sienna couldn't name. He didn't smile, didn't raise a glass. He just watched her, and in that quiet, breathless moment she realized they had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Before Sienna could fully collect herself, he was already there. "You look stunning," Callum said, his voice light casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. But there was something in the way he said it that made her breath catch. She blinked, surprised. "Thank you." He leaned in just slightly, enough for her to catch that familiar, clean scent, woodsy and expensive. "Ready for another round?" he asked, his tone smooth. Sienna gave him a small, deliberate smile. Always, he offered his arm. She took it. They walked into the dining room like they belonged at each other's side. The investors noticed immediately. Some smiled. Others nodded with wordless approval. The whispers were no longer whispers. The deal was practically sealed, and somehow her presence beside Callum had helped tip the scales. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt conflicted, because with every passing hour, it felt less and less like an act. Throughout dinner, Callum was exactly as he always was, composed, charismatic, completely at ease. He made polite conversation, listened intently, responded with that quiet confidence people mistook for charm. But every now and then, when no one was watching, he would brush his hand against hers, just barely, a ghost of contact, and each time it made her heart skip in a way she hated to admit. The line between performance and something else was blurring so fast, she couldn't tell which side she was on anymore. Later, after the toast to a successful partnership, he leaned in close enough for only her to hear. "You've been doing an incredible job," he murmured. His voice was low, warm, filled with something she couldn't quite name. Sienna turned slightly. Her lips were only inches from his jaw. "So have you." For a moment, he didn't move, just looked at her, and then his gaze dropped to her lips. She forgot how to breathe. "And then wonderful work, both of you." Charles Callahan's cheerful voice crashed through the moment like cold water. Sienna stepped back, smoothing her dress and forcing her expression neutral. Callum, as always, recovered in a heartbeat. "That's excellent news," he said, smiling at Charles. "I must say," Charles added with a grin, "seeing a couple so in sync professionally and personally, it's rare and inspiring." Sienna smiled, said something polite, and wished she could disappear. As soon as she could, she slipped away, escaping onto the balcony. The ocean breeze was cool against her skin, and for a moment it helped. But not enough, because the only thing in her head was him. This had started as a plan, a means to an end, so why did it feel like her heart had wandered into something far more dangerous? She didn't hear him approach, only recognized him by the warmth in his voice. "Running from the celebration?" Callum asked, settling beside her, leaning against the railing. "Just needed air. You're unusually quiet." Sienna folded her arms. "Are we taking this too far?" He glanced at her. "You mean the plan?" She hesitated. "Or something else?" Callum was silent for a moment. Then, more serious than she'd ever seen him, he turned to her. "What we're doing, it's working. The contract will be signed tomorrow. After that..." He trailed off. "After that, we go back to our lives," he finished, voice lower now. Sienna looked away, biting her bottom lip. "So this ends tomorrow?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her, long enough for her pulse to catch, long enough for her to see that same uncertainty flicker in his eyes. "If that's what you want," he said at last. The words landed with more weight than she was ready for, because she was supposed to want that. She was supposed to want things to go back to normal. But standing here beside him, heart tangled in emotions she hadn't meant to feel, she wasn't so sure anymore. And by the look in Callum's eyes, neither was he. That night, Sienna lay awake, her mind unraveling. The plan had worked. The deal would close. Everything had gone exactly as it should have. So why did it feel like something essential was slipping through her fingers? Why did the idea of walking away feel wrong? She closed her eyes, but all she saw was the way Callum had looked at her on that balcony. and suddenly the future felt more uncertain than ever. Sienna woke with a heaviness in her chest. Something was shifting. It was in the way Callum had looked at her last night, how his hand lingered a beat longer than necessary, how his voice softened when he asked if this would really end tomorrow. He had changed too. She felt it. But Callum Hayes was not a man who made emotions visible. He wore composure like a second skin, always in control, always several steps ahead. That mystery had once frustrated her. Now it frightened her, because if she couldn't read him, she couldn't protect herself. The mood at the resort had lifted by morning. The investors buzzed with energy, champagne was on ice, and final documents were being prepared for signatures. The deal was as good as done. Sienna walked into the main hall and immediately spotted him. Callum was seated at a table with Charles Callahan and a few others, relaxed, confident, perfectly composed, as if this moment belonged to him. But the second she entered, his eyes found hers, and held. She sat beside him, pretending not to feel the flicker of heat that moved through her at their closeness. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, voice low and casual. "Not really." He tilted his head slightly. "Any particular reason?" She hesitated, just thinking. Callum studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. It'll all be settled in a few hours, she knew that. And maybe that was the problem. The meeting began just after breakfast. Callum took the lead, speaking with his usual certainty. Sienna stood beside him, ensuring every document, every figure, every minor detail was flawless. And when the contracts were signed, when Callahan raised his glass in a congratulatory toast, it was all done. "I believe we've made the right choice," Charles said warmly. "And Callum, your partnership with Sienna, well, that sealed the deal for us." Sienna smiled politely. She should have felt triumphant, but all she felt was empty, because now the curtain could fall. The performance was over. No one would question a thing when they parted ways, and yet, somehow, she couldn't accept it. Later, while the others moved to the bar to celebrate, Sienna slipped away to the beach. The sky was soft with evening light, and the waves moved in slow, rhythmic whispers. She walked barefoot along the shoreline, letting the wind clear her thoughts. But no matter how far she walked, one thought followed. What if this hadn't been pretend? She didn't have to turn to know he was there. His footsteps behind her were unmistakable, measured, steady. Callum stopped beside her, hands in his pockets, hair tousled by the breeze. "Hiding again?" he asked gently. Sienna let out a breath. Just needed a moment. He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Understandable." She turned to him slowly. "What happens after this?" He was quiet for a while before answering. "You go back to your life. I go back to mine." Sienna gave a dry laugh. "Just like that." "That was the plan," he said, his voice quieter now. "From the beginning." She stared at the sand beneath her feet. "And you?" she asked softly. "Are you just going to forget all of this?" The question slipped out before she could reel it back. Callum frowned slightly, as if trying to understand what she truly meant. "Do you want me to forget?" he asked. She didn't answer because she didn't know. He stepped closer, his voice dropped lower. "Because if we're being honest, Sienna, I haven't forgotten anything." Her breath caught, not even the fact that this was supposed to be a game, or that somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like one. Sienna looked up at him and suddenly, nothing felt safe anymore, because this wasn't a performance. Not anymore. Callum raised a hand, brushing her hair gently from her cheek, his palm lingering there. "If you tell me this meant nothing to you," he said quietly, "I'll let it go. I'll walk away." She could lie, say it was just a role, that she had never meant it. She'd been pretending so well, but for the first time, she didn't want to pretend anymore. Sienna couldn't say it. Not because she didn't know the words, but because none of them would have been true. Callum gave a small, knowing smile, like he'd seen the answer in her eyes long before she admitted it to herself. "Then I guess we have a problem," he said quietly. She let out a breath of nervous laughter. "And what problem is that?" He leaned closer just enough for the distance to disappear. "I'm not ready to pretend this never happened." And before she could reply, before doubt could speak louder than desire, he kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't a question. It was steady, deliberate, like he wanted to memorize the shape of her lips, the way she melted into him, the exact way her breath caught between heartbeats. Her fingers gripped the collar of his shirt, holding him like she'd been waiting far too long. His arms wrapped around her waist, anchoring her to him as though he didn't want to let go, and for the first time, she didn't want to leave. But reality was a persistent thing. Sienna broke the kiss, breathless, stepping back like she needed space to breathe, even though every part of her ached to stay close. This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. Callum kept his eyes closed for a moment longer, then opened them slowly, and in that moment, he looked nothing like the man she'd known for years. Gone was the polished CEO, the carefully controlled executive. He looked real, raw, vulnerable. "It started as a performance," he said, voice quiet. "But don't ask me to pretend that's all it ever was." Something in her heart cracked, because she wanted to believe him, but she couldn't forget who he was, who they were. Callum Hayes, brilliant and calculated, a man who played the long game. And she didn't belong in his world of power and precision. "We need to think this through," Sienna said, barely more than a whisper. He watched her, serious now, but not angry. "If that's what you want." She nodded, mostly to convince herself, then turned and walked away from him, from the waves, from the one moment that had felt more real than anything else in her carefully ordered life. That night, during the farewell dinner, Sienna kept her distance. She sat across the room, surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, polite conversation. She smiled when she needed to, laughed when it was expected, but every time her eyes drifted to the far end of the room, she found Callum watching her, quietly, patiently, as if he was waiting for her to decide. But she couldn't risk it. If she let herself fall and he didn't catch her, it would break her. Later, she collapsed onto her bed, emotionally spent. She wanted sleep, silence, an end to the noise in her chest. But a soft knock at the door pulled her back into the storm. She didn't need to ask who it was. She already knew. Sienna stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Callum stood there, no suit jacket, just a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a look in his eyes that stripped her of every excuse. "You can't run forever," he said gently. "I'm not running," she replied, voice tight. "You are." He leaned against the doorframe, his voice barely above a whisper. "You feel what I feel. You're just scared to let it in." She looked away, arms wrapped around herself. "It's complicated, Callum. It doesn't have to be. We work together. You're my boss. This doesn't make sense." Callum stepped closer, his tone unwavering. "Then I'll make it make sense." Her defenses were unraveling. "Sienna," he began, but his voice was gentler now, less certain. She looked up at him, eyes already weary from resisting. He didn't plead. He didn't argue. "Just one chance," Callum said simply. "That's all I'm asking." And she closed her eyes not to shut him out, but to listen to what had already taken root in her chest. She couldn't find a reason to say no, so she didn't. When she opened her eyes again, her voice was barely above a whisper. One chance. The smile that spread across Callum's face wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, soft, like he knew he had just been handed something fragile. And Sienna, She knew she was already lost, but for the first time, she didn't want to be found. The next morning, she woke with a tightness in her chest. Not fear, something more complicated. Hope, maybe, or the weight of possibility. The words one chance still echoed in her mind, half promise, half plunge. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. The kiss, his words, the way it felt like the ground had shifted beneath them, just enough to change the path forward. The deal was done. The performance was over. She should have felt free. Instead, she felt like everything had just begun. Her phone buzzed. She half expected Natalie's name, but it was him. Callum, meet me in the lobby in 30. Brunch with the Callahans. Sienna stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, wondering what she was preparing herself for brunch, or the quiet storm still moving between them. When she arrived at the lobby, Callum was already there. Leaning back in one of the armchairs, his focus on his phone, dressed in a storm grey suit that made him look sharp enough to slice through doubt. She hesitated, but then he looked up. His gaze met hers. Not intense, not heavy, just sure. Ready? He asked, like nothing had changed. Sienna smiled tightly, uncertain. Yes. He offered his arm. She took it. And together they stepped into another performance. Except it didn't feel like acting anymore. Brunch was calm, pleasant. The Callahans were in high spirits, celebrating the contract's success, and Callum, ever the professional, slipped back into the rhythm of conversation with practiced ease. But Sienna saw it. Between the sips of coffee, the nods of agreement, and the half-smiles meant for investors, his eyes kept drifting back to her. Not for the show, for her. And that made it harder to breathe. Sienna, dear, Mrs. Callahan said warmly, her tone honeyed with admiration. You and Callum really do make a remarkable team. Sienna blinked, caught off guard. Oh, thank you. You two have such harmony, she continued. It's rare and beautiful to see. Sienna smiled politely, but her hands were tense in her lap. She felt Callum shift beside her, and when she glanced at him, he was smiling too. Indeed, he said, lifting his coffee to his lips. Was he just playing the part, or was he starting to believe in it too? After brunch, Callum walked her back to the elevator. Neither of them spoke until the doors slid open. Sienna crossed her arms, bracing herself. You didn't say anything about last night. Callum met her eyes. Did you want me to? She frowned. I don't know, but I thought, I expected something. You asked for time, he replied evenly. I'm giving it to you. Sienna sighed, frustration bubbling up. This is maddening. Why? Because, she said, voice rising slightly, I expected you to try harder. He stepped forward just enough to shorten the space between them. Sienna, he said, voice steady, you're already convinced. You just don't want to admit it. Her heart jumped. The elevator chimed softly. The doors opened. He tilted his head, a half smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. And then, very softly, are you going to step off? Or ask me to follow you? I'll wait for your answer, Callum had said softly, and then he turned and walked away. Sienna didn't move. She stood there, frozen in front of the elevator, feeling like the floor beneath her had simply vanished. That night, the resort felt quieter. Or maybe it was just her thoughts that grew louder. Their flight back was scheduled for the next morning, and the clock was running out. She had to choose. Stay in the safe shadows of logic, or step into something that could change everything. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Natalie, drink at the bar. Last night here. Sienna stared at the message, hesitated, then typed, Sienna, I'll meet you there. Maybe being around someone familiar would steady her heart, or maybe she was tired of hiding from it. Natalie was already at the bar when she arrived, swirling a pink cocktail with a slice of lime. Finally, she teased. I thought you were going to ghost me. Sienna smiled faintly, taking the seat beside her. I needed a minute. Natalie leaned in, her expression playful. A minute to think about your boss staring at you like he wants to ruin your whole dating history. Sienna's eyes widened. Natalie. Oh, come on. Natalie laughed. Callum Hayes might be emotionally elusive, but even he couldn't fake that look. Sienna rolled her eyes. It's not that simple. But maybe it should be, Natalie replied, sipping her drink. Sometimes we make things harder than they have to be. Sienna looked down at her glass, her voice quieter. What if it doesn't work? Natalie shrugged, eyes kind now. What if it does? The words echoed in Sienna's chest. And then she saw him. Callum. He walked into the bar like the world owed him nothing, confidence understated but unmistakable. He didn't scan the room, didn't look for her, but she knew the exact second he realized she was there. He walked past the crowd and settled at a quiet table in the back alone, and that's when she knew. If she didn't move now, she might regret it forever. Sienna stood up. Natalie raised an eyebrow. Where are you going? Sienna gave a soft smile. To do something I should have done hours ago. Natalie's eyes lit up. Finally, he was holding a glass of whiskey when she reached him. He didn't look surprised, just calm, still waiting. She crossed her arms. You said you were waiting for my answer. Callum set his glass down, his voice low. I was. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I don't want this to end. Something shifted in his expression. Then he stood, facing her fully. Are you sure? Sienna nodded. I am. His smile came slowly, but when it did, it reached his eyes. Then you finally understand. She tilted her head, confused. Understand what? Callum reached up, brushing his thumb lightly across her cheek, that this was never just a game. Before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her. This kiss wasn't tentative or questioning, it was full of intention. Callum kissed her like someone who had waited, truly waited, to find something that felt real. And Sienna? She kissed him back like she finally believed she deserved it. She didn't care about rules or risks, not in that moment. All she cared about was the feel of his hands at her waist, the softness of his breath, the warmth of him so close. When they pulled apart, Sienna's heart was a storm in her chest. Callum looked at her, something almost reverent in his eyes. You have no idea, he murmured, how long I've wanted this. I think I do, she whispered. He smiled gentler than she'd ever seen and let his fingertips drift across her cheek. Let's talk, he said softly. She nodded, but not here. They left the bar hand in hand, walking through the quiet resort, past flickering lanterns and hushed voices, until they reached the beach. The ocean was calm, rolling in soft waves beneath the stars. Sienna inhaled deeply, letting the sea air fill her lungs. I'm not someone who dives into things without thinking, she said, finally turning to face him. Callum nodded, his hands still holding hers. And yet, he said, voice full of quiet wonder, you're here. His hands found her arms, steady and warm. I know, Callum said, his voice quiet but clear. Sienna hesitated before finishing her thought, and neither are you. He let out a slow breath, something tired and honest in it. No, I'm not, but with you, it doesn't feel like risk. It feels like finally breathing. The wind tugged at her hair, brushing it across her cheek. She barely noticed. Callum, she said, voice trembling, if we do this, we can't undo it. He stepped closer. I don't want to go back. Her pulse skipped. But what about work? She whispered. The company, the image, everything we've built. He reached up, cupping her chin, gently tilting her face toward his. If I say I'm willing to take the risk, are you? The question hovered in the still air, delicate but heavy with meaning. Sienna closed her eyes for just a moment, letting herself listen to the sea, to her breath, to the quiet thrum of her heart that had been leading her here all along. Then, softly, she nodded. Yes. Callum exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath for days. Then, we're in this together. She didn't answer with words. She answered when she stepped into his arms again. And this time, when he kissed her, it wasn't about pretense, or strategy, or even courage. It was about finally saying yes to what had been there all along. The next morning, Sienna woke with a feeling she hadn't known in a long time. A kind of quiet contentment that hummed beneath the surface like sunlight warming her skin. They'd returned to their rooms after the beach, no impulsive decisions, no staying the night, but something had shifted. There was a thread between them now, invisible but strong. It pulsed with certainty. Her phone buzzed just as she zipped her suitcase shut. Callum, meet me in the lobby before we leave for the airport. His voice, when she picked up, was low, familiar, and different. I'll be there, she said. He was already waiting when she stepped into the lobby, impeccably dressed as always. But it wasn't his suit that made her pause. It was the small, quiet smile that curved his lips when he saw her. Not the public smile, not the professional one. This one was just for her. And her heart forgot how to beat for a second. The flight home was uneventful on the surface. Smooth skies, quiet conversation. But in the quiet spaces between takeoff and landing, something unspoken moved between them, like the beginning of a story neither of them were pretending to tell anymore. This time, they sat side by side. And this time, Sienna didn't shift away when their arms touched. Back in the city, the rhythm of their old lives crashed back in like a tide. The office, the reports, the meetings, their return didn't slow the machine, but it changed everything underneath. Because this time, Sienna didn't feel like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't, and every time Callum's eyes met hers across the room, every stolen glance, every near touch reminded her the choice had already been made. It wasn't until the last employee left that he stepped into her office. Callum closed the door behind him. Well, he said with a half smile, we survived day one. Sienna let out a soft laugh. At this rate, no one will ever suspect a thing. He tilted his head. And do you want that? For no one to know? She crossed her arms, half teasing, half unsure. I don't know yet. Callum took a single step forward, his eyes searching hers. I can wait. Her breath caught. But for how long? His smile deepened, but it was gentle, not smug. As long as it takes for you to believe you don't have to run anymore. Sienna closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her chest. Because he was right. She had been running, from vulnerability, from risk, from anything she couldn't control. But not this time. This time, she didn't want to run. When she opened her eyes, he was still there, waiting, patient, like he always had been. She stepped forward slowly until there was no space left between them. I think I already have, she whispered. He raised an eyebrow, amused. Really? She smiled, soft and certain. Yes. Callum leaned in, his voice barely a breath. Then, I guess we finally won this game. Callum's fingers brushed softly beneath Sienna's jaw, tilting her face up toward his. Sienna. And then, he kissed her. But this wasn't like before. There was no tension, no waiting, no more pretending. This kiss wasn't fueled by uncertainty or convenience. It was something else entirely. It was quiet conviction, a promise without words. Sienna's hand clutched his shirt tightly, anchoring herself to the moment, as if afraid the ground beneath them might disappear. But it didn't. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Callum rested his forehead against hers. You know what this means, don't you? He whispered. Sienna nodded, her voice soft. Yes. His hands were still at her face, as if he was trying to memorize her. Then, there's no going back. A laugh escaped her lips, quiet, but free. I was never good at going back. Callum smiled, just a little. Then his expression shifted, more serious now. We need to talk about how we're going to handle this. She nodded. I agree. We can't let this affect the company. It has to stay separate, so... We keep it private, he said slowly, reading her face. At least for now, she said. I don't want whispers or assumptions. I want people to respect what we've built professionally. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll respect that. But you should know I'm not good at hiding how I feel. She smiled. I know. The office clock blinked close to 9 p.m. The building was quiet, everyone had long since gone. Callum grabbed his jacket from the chair and slid it on with his usual precision. I'll take you home, he said, his voice casual. Sienna raised an eyebrow. You don't have to. I'm perfectly capable. He picked up her bag from the edge of the desk and handed it to her with a shrug. I know, but I want to. She shook her head, amused, but didn't protest. They walked to the underground garage together, the soft echo of their footsteps bouncing off concrete walls. Callum opened the passenger door for her, and she stepped in with a quiet thank you. The city glowed around them, windows alight with stories they'd never know. Sienna leaned her head against the glass, letting the hum of the car lull her into a kind of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. What are you thinking about? Callum asked, eyes still on the road. This, she said softly, is a risk. He glanced at her, a flicker of amusement in his smile. You've taken risks with me before, none like this. He stopped at a red light and turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. Sienna, he asked, voice low, do you trust me? She looked at him for a long beat. Then, quietly, yes. The light turned green, and he drove on, but something had shifted, something invisible, yet final. When they reached her apartment building, Sienna opened the door but paused, her hand lingering on the handle. She turned to him, heart racing. Do you want to come in? Callum's eyes darkened slightly. Do you want me to? She hesitated for only a second. I do. He turned off the engine without a word. Inside, she clicked on the lights, and the space filled with warmth. It wasn't extravagant, just hers. Soft greys and earth tones, framed prints, a stack of unread books, a half-finished mug on the side table. Callum stepped in slowly, looking around. It's exactly how I imagined it, he said. Sienna frowned playfully. My apartment? He turned to her. It feels like you. She laughed, kicking off her shoes and curling up on the couch. Was that supposed to be a compliment? Maybe, he replied, loosening his tie as he sat beside her. Would you like some coffee? She asked, already rising. Callum caught her wrist gently. I'd prefer something stronger. She blinked. You want a drink? He held her gaze. No, I want something else. Her breath hitched. Before she could speak, his hand found her cheek, and his thumb swept gently across her skin. Sienna. But she didn't let him finish. She kissed him, and in that kiss was every word they hadn't said, every emotion they'd buried under logic and planning and perfectly timed conversations. That night unfolded slowly, not like a storm, but like a homecoming. No grand declarations, no promises inked on paper, just fingertips tracing the shape of trust. Quiet laughter in the kitchen, the rustle of sheets, the softness of silence, and the look in his eyes that told her this wasn't temporary anymore. Sienna Morgan woke to the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting through her apartment. For a moment she stayed still beneath the covers, wondering if the dream she'd had of everything finally falling into place was still just that, a dream. But then she opened her eyes and saw Callum standing in her kitchen, shirtless, wearing only the trousers from his suit the night before, focused intently on the coffee machine. The sight made her blink twice. Callum Hayes, the man whose life was always buttoned up, pressed, calculated, was barefoot in her kitchen, looking human. "Good morning," he said without turning, but with a quiet smile tugging at his lips. She sat up slowly, the bedsheets slipping from her shoulders. "You know how to make coffee?" "I know how to do a lot of things," he replied, still facing the machine. Sienna Morgan chuckled as she walked over. "This feels surreal." "What does?" "You. Here, no tie, no cufflinks, no sharp comebacks, just you." He finally turned to her, placing a mug into her hands. "Does it bother you?" She looked down at the steam curling from the cup, then back at him. "No, it surprises me, but in a good way." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping slowly. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, it was warm, full, and that's when it hit her she didn't want this to be temporary. She wanted this exact moment, his quiet presence, their easy laughter, this shared softness to be part of her everyday life. Callum must have noticed the change in her expression. "You're thinking something," he said gently. Sienna Morgan smiled. "I'm thinking this might actually work." He placed his cup on the counter and stepped toward her, framing her face with both hands. Sienna Morgan. I never doubted it. Not once. And just like that, the walls she'd been holding up finally lowered. She leaned in as he kissed her slow and steady, like he already knew this was the start of something that mattered. That morning, she knew with quiet certainty she would never run again. Their relationship deepened from that point on, moving from whispered secrets to something more solid, more enduring. At work, nothing seemed to have changed. Callum remained the brilliant, exacting CEO, and Sienna Morgan the unflinching assistant who ran his world. But between glances, in passing notes, and on business trips, everything was different. The nights became theirs, filled with stolen moments, quiet dinners, shared silences. In her apartment, Callum would try and fail to cook dinner, blaming the oven, then promptly order Thai food with a grin. On weekends, they escaped the city to quiet retreats where they could breathe, where Callum laughed without restraint, and Sienna Morgan found herself telling stories she hadn't shared with anyone before. One night, curled up on her couch, with her head resting against his chest, she looked up and smiled. "Did you ever think we'd end up like this?" Callum let out a soft chuckle. "Not even in my most improbable projections." She raised an eyebrow. "So, when did you know that you were, in love with you?" he asked, playing with her fingers. "I think I always knew. But maybe it was when you walked into my hotel room like a hurricane, completely out of place, and somehow everything made sense." Sienna Morgan sat up, mock offended. "I wasn't that drunk." "You snored," Callum said, deadpan. "I did not." "Just a little," he teased. She laughed, unable to stay annoyed. But then he grew quiet, threading their fingers tighter. "Truthfully, I think I started falling for you the moment you stood your ground and didn't care who I was. You challenged me, and you never once let me hide." Her breath caught in her throat. "Callum." He touched her lips with a single finger. "And that's why I've been planning." Callum looked at Sienna Morgan with a quiet glint in his eyes, the kind that only appeared when he was up to something. "I've been planning something for tonight," he said casually, his voice unusually soft. Sienna Morgan blinked, confused. "What are you?" But before she could finish, Callum slowly dropped to one knee. Her world went completely still. She instinctively brought her hands to her mouth, eyes wide. "Callum, what are you doing?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Except it wasn't what she expected. The ring looked bent, imperfect, almost like a piece of wire that had gone through something traumatic. She squinted. "Wait, is that a ring or an abstract art project?" Callum gave a dramatic sigh. This is what happens when a man decides to make a ring by hand. No training, just pure, reckless optimism. You made this? She asked, somewhere between stunned and hysterical. Yes, and nearly sacrificed a finger in the process. Sienna Morgan burst into laughter, leaning on the back of the couch to steady herself. Callum, you're a millionaire. You could have bought the most flawless ring on the planet. He smiled, unbothered. But I didn't want perfect. I wanted something that felt like us imperfect, unexpected, entirely our own. Her laughter faded into a quiet hush, her chest suddenly full, her eyes stung with tears she didn't expect. You're serious, she whispered. He nodded and reached for her hand, his gaze steady. Sienna Morgan, you've challenged me in ways no one else ever dared. You've irritated me, inspired me, and completely wrecked every rule I thought I lived by. And somehow, you made it all feel like coming home. So yes, I know love and work don't usually mix. But we've never followed the usual, have we? So let's break one more rule. He took a breath and looked into her eyes. Will you marry me? Sienna Morgan's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might leap out of her chest. She couldn't stop smiling or crying. I want to say yes, she said softly, slipping the crooked ring onto her finger. But can we maybe also get one that doesn't look like it was run over by a bicycle? Callum laughed and pulled her into a kiss. So, that's a yes? She kissed him again. Yes. You ridiculous, wonderful man. The wedding took place a few months later, under the golden light of a late afternoon sun at a hillside vineyard draped in string lights. A rustic wooden arch stood at the center, wrapped in ivory flowers and soft eucalyptus leaves. The moment felt both elegant and utterly simple, intentional, real. Sienna Morgan walked down the aisle in a graceful minimal gown, one that moved like water and reflected her quiet strength. Callum stood at the altar, sharp in a tailored suit, but it wasn't the clothes that struck her, it was his eyes. He looked at her like she was the only person who had ever existed. As she reached him, he whispered, "You're breathtaking." She smiled through her nerves. "And you look like someone who's finally realized he can't control everything." He chuckled quietly. "Not where you're concerned." The ceremony began, but for them, the world had narrowed to a heartbeat. When it was time for vows, Callum took her hand, and with the same calm certainty he used to close multi-million-dollar deals, he said, "Sienna Morgan, you've dismantled every belief I had about love. You taught me that life isn't only built on order and logic, it's meant to be felt. You've made me laugh more, live more, be more. So today, I promise to keep rewriting the rules with you. I promise to love you on the days when it's easy, and especially on the days when it's not. And I solemnly swear I will never attempt to make another ring." The crowd laughed warmly. Sienna Morgan wiped a tear from her cheek and took a breath before replying. "Callum, if someone had told me the cold, calculating man I once called Sir would end up being the love of my life, I'd have laughed them out of the room. But you proved me wrong in the best possible way. You annoy me, you push me, you challenge me to see things differently, and you make me feel more seen than I've ever been. So today, I promise to love you through spreadsheets, missed meetings, your awful cooking, and even the way you burn your tongue on coffee because you refuse to wait." Laughter filled the air again, gentle and full of joy. The officiant smiled. "And now, you may kiss your bride." Callum didn't hesitate. As their lips met this time not as a performance or a promise, but as a truth fully chosen, the guests cheered, but neither of them heard it. Because at that moment, for Callum and Sienna Morgan, the world had narrowed again, into something simple, profound, and entirely theirs. Callum didn't hesitate. He cupped Sienna Morgan's face with both hands and kissed her not like it was the first time, or the last, but like it was every time that ever mattered. Like forever was something he could hold in that one breathless moment. Around them, the guests erupted in cheers, but for Sienna Morgan, everything else faded into soft, distant noise. There was only him, only this. As they slowly pulled apart, her eyes met his, wide with wonder, still slightly dazed by it all. "We're really married," she whispered, like she still needed to hear it out loud to believe it. Callum smiled, gently brushing his thumb along her cheek. "And this," he said, "is the best contract I've ever signed." Sienna Morgan let out a laugh, part joy, part disbelief, and pulled him into another kiss, this one lighter, full of laughter and something beautifully unguarded. From that moment forward, there were no more roles to play, no more pretending, no more blurred lines between business and something deeper, because their love was never just a clever performance. It was the truth, undeniable, unexpected, and wonderfully real. And it would be forever. If their story made you laugh, cry, or believe a little more in the magic of unexpected love, tell us in the comments below. On a scale of 0 to 10, what's your rating? Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and explore more heartfelt stories with us. Sometimes love doesn't come in the way we planned. Sometimes it barges into the wrong room and changes everything.